When I called my son, Ethan, to ask when the wedding would be, his fiancée, Mara, looked me straight in the eye and said with a cool smile, "Oh, we already got married yesterday. We only invited special people." The words hung in the air like frost, coating my heart in disbelief. Special people. I stood frozen in my own living room, the receiver trembling in my hand as if it suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. I had spent 3 years paying their rent, filling their pantry, and furnishing their home down to the last spoon, believing I was building a family bond. But in that single moment, I realized I had been nothing more than a wallet with a pulse. The pale pink dress I had chosen for Mara's big day still hung in my closet, unworn and meaningless. I had picked it out with care, imagining how radiant she'd look standing beside my son, how proud I would feel watching him start his life. I had saved money for a gift, cleaned my house from top to bottom, even told my sister to fly in for the ceremony. And yet, I was not invited, not even told. They had smiled, posed for pictures with her family, toasted champagne, and said their vows while I sat at home thinking they were still planning. Later that evening, I saw the photos on social media. There they were. Mara in the dress I helped pay for, Ethan holding her hand with a grin that used to belong to my little boy. Her parents stood proudly beside them, glasses raised. My name, my face, my existence, nowhere to be seen. Each photograph felt like a dagger of clarity. I was not part of their special world. I remember touching the fabric of the dress I had bought for myself, its soft shimmer mocking me under the closet light. The shoes I'd saved for months to buy were still wrapped in tissue paper. I sat down on the edge of my bed and tried to make sense of it, but logic failed. Love isn't supposed to require an invitation. A mother shouldn't have to earn her place at her child's wedding. Ethan called the next day, his tone rehearsed, as if reading from a script Mara had approved. "Mum, it was just something small, very private." I could hear laughter in the background, hers light and victorious. My voice cracked when I asked, "Private from whom?" There was silence, silence that screamed louder than any insult ever could. For hours after that call, I walked through my house like a ghost. Every corner held a memory of the sacrifices I'd made, the rent payments, the groceries, the gifts, the countless small rescues. I had done it all for love, for family, and yet, in their most important moment, I was forgotten, erased, unwanted. That night, as the lights dimmed and my reflection stared back from the window, I whispered the words that would change everything. Never again. Something inside me cracked, not a break of weakness, but the sound of a cage unlocking. A week after the wedding revelation, Mara's voice returned to my phone, this time trembling. "Evelyn, the rent is overdue. The landlord's threatening to evict us. You must have forgotten the transfer." Forgotten. As if 3 years of my life had been one long clerical error. I sat there in silence, remembering every moment I had sacrificed so they could live comfortably. The birthdays I spent alone, the meals I skipped to make their payments on time. My heart didn't break this time. It hardened. "Mara," I said calmly, my tone steady in a way that even surprised me. "Didn't I tell you I only help special people?" The silence on the other end stretched into eternity. For once, it wasn't me who trembled. Her practiced sweetness slipped into panic. "Evelyn, please, I don't understand. You've always said we were special to you." Special, the same poisoned word that had crushed me days before. "Yes," I replied quietly, "but now I see that special to you means useful." My own words filled the air like iron. I could almost hear her face falling, the desperation creeping in. "We were just under pressure. It wasn't personal," she stammered, her excuses folding in on themselves. As she spoke, I looked around my home. The refrigerator I had filled for them countless times, the bills I'd paid, the furniture I'd chosen with care. It was as if the ghosts of my generosity surrounded me, whispering reminders of every time I had mistaken duty for love. My hands stopped shaking. I felt something powerful. Clarity. "No," I said finally, cutting through her pleading. "You made your choices. Now I'm making mine." I ended the call without waiting for her reply. The click of the phone landing on its cradle felt like a seal closing a chapter of my life. For the first time in years, I wasn't acting out of guilt or fear. That night, I made myself a simple dinner: soup, bread, a small glass of wine. The silence in my kitchen wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. I didn't check my phone. I didn't imagine their voices or their apologies. I let the quiet fill me like oxygen. For decades, I had confused love with rescue, but rescue had become my prison. That night, I unlocked the door from the inside and stepped out of it forever. When dawn came, the house felt different, lighter, though nothing had changed except me. The morning light slid across the kitchen table where my checkbook waited like a silent witness. For years, I'd written those transfers automatically, never daring to total them. Now I opened every bank statement and spread them across the wood like evidence in a trial. "Let's see how much blindness costs," I whispered. Each receipt was a fragment of devotion: rent payments, grocery deliveries, last-minute gifts to fix their forgotten anniversaries. My pen moved slowly, trembling between disbelief and anger. 500 a month for rent, 18,000. 200 for food, another 7,000. Birthdays, furniture, repairs, $33,400. I stared at the final number as if it were a stranger who had just confessed a betrayal. The room spun, not from grief, but from realization. I hadn't lost money. I had traded it for the illusion of belonging. All those transfers were not acts of love. They were payments for silence, for the hope that my son might someday look at me the way he used to when he was small and still believed I could fix everything. But love bought with guilt always expires. I sat back, the chair creaking under the weight of the sum and the years behind it. The pale morning light had grown brighter, unforgiving. My late husband's photo on the shelf seemed to watch me with quiet reproach. "You were supposed to live peacefully, not pay for their comfort." Tears threatened, but I didn't let them fall. Instead, I wrote one last line at the bottom of the page: "Total owed to myself, $33,400. Then I underlined it twice. Something in that act shifted the air. I wasn't a victim balancing losses anymore. I was an accountant reclaiming her life. Every dollar counted wasn't gone. It was a lesson purchased, proof that generosity without respect becomes servitude. I folded the paper neatly and placed it in a folder marked "Future." For once, the word didn't frighten me. When the sun finally reached the window pane, I brewed coffee, strong and bitter. I drank it standing, watching dust particles rise like tiny sparks in the golden light. The house was quiet, and for the first time, the silence didn't echo with need. It hummed with possibility. The phone began to ring before the sun had fully risen. I stared at it, as if it were a living thing, shrill and desperate. But I didn't move. For years, I'd answered every call, always ready to rescue, to soothe, to pay. Now, I let it ring until it stopped. The silence that followed was cleaner than any apology could ever be. 10 minutes later, it rang again. Then again. Max, then Mara, then Max once more. I set the phone down face down and poured myself coffee, the dark aroma wrapping around me like armor. It wasn't indifference, it was self-preservation. For the first time, their emergencies weren't mine. After breakfast, I dressed carefully. A pressed blouse, my soft wool cardigan, the good shoes I had been saving for special occasions. Today felt like one. At the bank, the polished floors reflected back a woman I barely recognized, upright, composed, deliberate. Mr. Klein, the branch manager, looked up from his desk, surprised to see me without the usual anxious expression. "I need to cancel all automatic transfers," I said, "and I want to make sure no one else can access my accounts." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Are you sure, Mrs. Richter?" "I've never been more sure of anything," I replied. As he processed the papers, my phone buzzed incessantly in my purse. I didn't even look. When he handed me the documents, his tone softened. "You've been very generous, you know. Most people wouldn't have gone this far for family." I met his eyes. "Generosity without gratitude isn't kindness. It's self-destruction." He nodded slowly, the way people do when they realize you've just told them a truth they didn't expect to hear. Back home, 3 missed calls blinked on the screen. I turned off the phone entirely and set it in a drawer. Then I made myself lunch, something simple and warm, and ate it without the usual rush to be available. The food tasted richer somehow, flavored by peace instead of anxiety. By afternoon, I gathered the folders with my bank records, my husband's savings, and my personal notes, locking them carefully in a drawer. I labeled it mine in bold letters. It wasn't selfishness, it was reclamation. For a while, I simply sat in my living room and listened. The ticking clock, the faint rustle of wind, even my own breathing, all the sounds I used to drown out with worry, now sounded like life itself. When evening came, the sun slid low, gilding the furniture I had once bought for Max and Mara. I used to imagine them sitting there, grateful, content, a picture of the family I'd paid to keep together. Now I saw those same chairs differently, not as shrines to sacrifice, but as reminders of lessons earned. I poured myself a glass of wine and raised it silently to no one in particular. "To freedom," I whispered, "to finally meaning it." Outside, the last light faded, and the house settled into a kind of stillness that wasn't lonely at all. It was mine. It happened on a Tuesday morning, one of those clear, cold days when the light makes everything look honest. I had just finished washing the dishes when I heard the front gate slam. The sound was sharp, deliberate. I glanced through the window and froze. Max and Mara were walking up the path, both dressed in dark coats, their expressions set. Between them walked a man I didn't recognize, tall, with a briefcase, and the kind of confidence that comes from being paid to deliver bad news. They didn't knock. The doorbell rang once, then the doorknob turned as if they owned the place. I opened the door before they could enter on their own. "You should have called," I said, my voice steady. Mara gave me that rehearsed smile that always hid knives. "We thought it would be easier this way. This is Mr. Halpin, our attorney." "Attorney?" I repeated. "For what?" Max stepped forward, avoiding my eyes. "Mum, this is just a formality. We're worried about you. You've been acting strangely lately, forgetting things, making reckless decisions." Mr. Halpin opened his briefcase, pulling out a stack of papers. "Mrs. Richter, your son and daughter-in-law are filing a petition for guardianship. They believe you may be incapable of managing your finances responsibly." For a moment, the world narrowed to a soundless pulse. I could see Mara's satisfaction flicker like a match behind her calm mask. Guardianship. an elegant word for theft. I straightened my shoulders. You think because I stopped paying your bills, I've lost my mind? Mara's smile faltered. Please, Evelyn, this isn't personal. We're only trying to protect you. I laughed then, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in years. It startled even me. Protect me? You already drained $33,000 and my trust along with it. What else do you plan to save me from? My own freedom. Mr. Halpin cleared his throat. Perhaps it would be best to discuss this calmly. If you refuse to cooperate, the court will require an evaluation. I gestured toward the door. Then you can explain to the judge how I remembered to lock you out. Max stepped closer, his face red. Mum, please don't make this worse. You need help. You're not yourself. I met his gaze, and for the first time, I didn't see my son. I saw a man who had chosen comfort over conscience. No, Max, I said softly. I'm finally myself. You just don't recognize me because I stopped kneeling. He flinched, as if struck. For a long, tense moment, none of us moved. Then Mara reached out, her voice honeyed and false. You can still make this easy, Evelyn. Sign the papers, and we'll take care of everything. I looked down at the stack in her manicured hand, and then back at her eyes. You've already taken enough. With deliberate calm, I walked to the door, opened it wide, and stood aside. Leave. Now. Mr. Halpin began to speak again, but I raised my hand. You're trespassing. If you don't go, I'll call the police. I suggest you explain that to your next client. They left without another word. The gate slammed again, louder this time. I locked the door and leaned against it, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was aftermath. I went to the living room, sat down, and stared at the papers they'd left behind on the table. The legal letterhead gleamed under the morning light like a challenge. I could have cried, but instead I found myself laughing again, low, steady, incredulous. They thought they could strip me of control. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I gathered the papers neatly, slipped them into a folder, and wrote on the cover in firm letters, Evidence. Then I placed it beside the one marked Mine. The symmetry made me smile. By noon, I had called my lawyer, Mr. Weber, whose steady voice and quiet outrage gave me courage. He told me what I already knew, but needed to hear aloud. This isn't a family dispute anymore, Evelyn. It's an attempt at legal manipulation. Don't talk to them without me present. I won't, I promised. After I hung up, I walked through my home, touching each piece of furniture, each photo frame, each small token of my life. Everything they had tried to claim felt more mine than ever. The air in the house no longer carried their shadows. It belonged to me again. When the sun dipped low that evening, I stood by the window, the world outside tinted in soft gold. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who said yes to everything, who confused generosity with love. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone unyielding, not cruel, but awake. And if they ever tried to come for me again, I would be ready. The next morning, I woke to an unfamiliar quiet. No anxious phone calls, no guilt clinging to the edges of my day. The sunlight through the curtains was soft and clean, as if even the air had been scrubbed of their presence. I brewed my coffee, took a long breath, and realized something extraordinary. I wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, my mind wasn't occupied by someone else's emergencies. It belonged entirely to me. Yet beneath that calm ran a steady pulse of fury. The nerve of them, to walk into my home with a lawyer, to speak of incompetence while living off my labor. I wouldn't let that insult stand. I gathered the folder marked Evidence from the table tucked it into my purse, and called Mr. Webber's office. His secretary said he could see me at noon. By the time I reached his building, the morning had sharpened into something resolute. Mr. Webber greeted me with the same warm professionalism I remembered from years ago when he'd handled my husband's estate. His grey eyes softened when he saw my expression. "Evelyn," he said, "I heard a little about what happened yesterday. Sit down and tell me everything." I did. Every word, every gesture, every calculated cruelty. When I finished, he sat back, silent for a long moment. "What your children attempted," he said finally, "is called elder financial abuse. It's more common than most people realize. Using guilt and manipulation to control an older person's assets, sometimes even the law itself." He slid a legal pad across the desk. "We'll start by documenting everything. Every transfer, every gift, every time they pressured you. It's not about revenge, it's about protection." As he spoke, a strange relief washed over me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I had been abused, and now it had a name. For 3 hours, we went through records, bank statements, receipts. Years of misplaced generosity transformed into evidence. When we finished, he looked up from his notes. "Evelyn, from today forward, you make no contact with them without me present. I'll file a notice to revoke any shared access to your accounts. And if they show up again, you call the police. Not later. Immediately." I nodded, my throat tight. "You really think they'll try again?" He smiled faintly. "They always do, until they learn they're dealing with someone who won't bend." When I stepped out of the building, the world looked different. Clearer, harder, but also fairer. The city air, usually heavy with noise, seemed almost musical. I walked slower than usual, savouring the rhythm of my own footsteps. At the hardware store, I bought new locks. At the bank, I opened a fresh account in my name only, somewhere Max and Mara would never think to look. Each act felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by paperwork. My home felt lighter, as though invisible chains had been cut. I checked every bill, changed every password, shredded every letter that still carried their names. Each rip of paper was a declaration of independence. When the phone rang, I ignored it. I didn't need to hear another plea disguised as affection. I knew their rhythm now. The sudden sweetness, the fabricated emergencies. They'd say anything except sorry. By evening, the sun hung low, painting gold across my freshly locked door. I poured a glass of wine, a habit I'd given up years ago out of thrift, and toasted quietly to the empty room. "To freedom," I whispered, and the words felt sacred. Still, I couldn't help wondering, who had I been all these years? The woman who paid their rent, bought their furniture, smiled through humiliation. Was that really me? I thought of my late husband, Robert, of how he'd trusted me to live comfortably after his death. I had turned that comfort into their lifeline, but not anymore. That night, I spread the papers Mr. Webber had organized across my table. Seeing it all in black and white was sobering. The money lost was painful, yes, but the years wasted trying to buy affection hurt far worse. I had mistaken need for love, dependency for closeness. Now I understood something simple, but profound. Love that costs you your dignity isn't love, it's debt. I slept deeply for the first time in years, the kind of sleep that feels earned. In my dream, I was walking through my house, room by room, turning off lights, each one dimming a memory that no longer held power over me. When I reached the front door, I turned the key, locked it, and felt peace settle in my chest like sunlight. When I woke, it was still dark outside. But inside me, morning had already begun. The days that followed were strangely bright, as if the world itself approved of my rebellion. Each morning, I woke earlier, savouring the quiet hum of my home before the day began. I made my bed with crisp precision, brewed my coffee, and sat by the window just to watch the street come alive. I hadn't realized how much beauty I'd ignored while drowning in someone else's chaos. My first step toward renewal was security. I replaced every lock and added a new alarm system, the kind that chirped softly when I opened a door. The sound became a kind of reassurance, a heartbeat reminding me that this house and this peace were mine alone. When the technician finished, he smiled politely and said, "You'll sleep better now." I smiled back. I already do. The second step was silence. I blocked their numbers, one by one. Max's, Mara's, even the unknown ones that might have been them. The first few days, I checked my voicemail out of habit, but soon the compulsion faded. The absence of their voices wasn't emptiness. It was air. I hadn't realized how suffocating noise could be until it stopped. For years, I had put myself last, feeding others while forgetting my own hunger. Now, I began to rediscover small rituals that felt like care rather than duty. One Friday afternoon, I walked past the salon I hadn't entered in years. My reflection in the glass startled me. The grey bun, the tired eyes, the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime apologizing. I hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. "Good afternoon," said a woman with bright red glasses and a kind smile. "It's been a while since we've seen you." "It's been a while since I've seen me," I replied. An hour later, my hair was trimmed into a soft silver bob that framed my face like light. I felt almost foolishly young, not because I looked it, but because I had chosen it for no one but myself. When I stepped outside, the breeze caught the ends of my hair, and for a fleeting moment, I felt like the world had tilted slightly in my favor. That night, I cooked a meal from scratch, a proper one, with herbs and wine, not the simple reheated dishes I used to make out of habit. I set the table for one, lit a candle, and ate slowly. Every bite was a statement. I deserve this. It was during that dinner that I heard a soft knock at the door. My body stiffened. Old instinct. But when I peered through the window, I saw not Mara's sharp silhouette, but my neighbour Eleanor from 2 doors down. She held a small plate wrapped in foil and smiled when she saw me. "I thought you might like some pie," she said. "It's too much for me alone." I hesitated, then opened the door. "You just saved my evening," I said, and meant it. Eleanor laughed, her voice like the crackle of a warm fire. "Then I'll bring the rest tomorrow. We can call it a fair trade if you promise to share that candlelight next time." She stayed for tea that night, and conversation flowed easily. We spoke not as strangers, but as women who had weathered similar storms: loneliness, disappointment, survival. She listened without pity, and when she spoke of her own battles, I recognized the same quiet strength in her eyes that I was just beginning to claim in mine. When she left, the house didn't feel empty. It felt lived in, balanced. I looked at the second teacup drying on the counter and smiled. It was proof that healing didn't mean isolation. It meant choice. Later, before bed, I stood at my window, watching the lamplight shimmer on the street below. The locks were new, the phone was silent, and the air smelled faintly of lavender from the candle I'd let burn low. I realized that freedom wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and self-earned. When I finally lay down, the sheets cool and smooth, I felt something rare and precious blooming inside me. Trust. Not in anyone else this time, but in myself. And that, I thought as my eyes closed, was the truest safety I'd ever known. Eleanor returned the next morning with the promised pie, but this time she didn't leave after tea. We sat together in my kitchen, sunlight spilling through the curtains, and I told her everything: the wedding, the betrayal, the quiet war that had followed. She listened in silence, nodding, her eyes filled not with pity but with recognition. When I finished, she set her cup down gently and said, "You did the right thing, Evelyn. I went through the same storm, and it nearly sank me." Her words startled me. She leaned back, sighing as if pulling memories from a deep drawer. My daughter, Fiona, depended on me for years. I paid her rent, her debts, her whims. I thought if I just gave enough, she'd finally love me. But love that must be bought is never real. When I stopped paying, she stopped calling. It broke me at first. I thought I'd lost her forever. But a year later, she came back. Not for money, but for forgiveness. The story poured out of her like confession and blessing all at once. I felt something shift inside me, a quiet relief that I wasn't the only fool who had confused giving with loving. "Do you think Max will ever come back?" I asked. Eleanor smiled sadly. "Maybe, but if he does, it must be as a son, not as a collector." We laughed softly, the kind of laughter that comes from shared scars. The conversation flowed like water, no awkwardness, no judgment. When she left, the house felt different, not emptier, but lighter. There was a kind of quiet between us that didn't demand anything. I watched her walk down the path, her white curls shining under the morning sun, and thought of how kindness can arrive late in life, yet still feel perfectly timed. That evening, I wrote in my journal for the first time in years. The words came easily. We are not weak for wanting love. We are only mistaken when we believe we must pay for it. I closed the book and smiled. Maybe, just maybe, the healing wasn't in forgetting what happened, but in realizing I was never alone in it. The morning was cool and grey when I decided to visit Robert's grave. It had been years since I last went, though I often told myself I was simply waiting for the right moment. Now I understood there was no perfect time for grief, only the quiet courage to face it. I stopped at the florist on the corner and chose a small bouquet of white lilies. They were his favourite, simple, unpretentious, and fragrant enough to fill the car as I drove. The road to the cemetery wound past the park where we used to walk after dinner, where he'd tell me stories that made the years feel shorter. The memories rose like mist on the glass, soft and haunting. When I reached the cemetery, the air felt heavy with stillness. I parked near the old oak tree and followed the path, the sound of gravel under my shoes the only rhythm. His name was carved deep into the stone, the letters weathered but proud. Robert Richter, beloved husband and friend. I knelt and brushed away a few fallen leaves. For a long time I said nothing. I had imagined this moment would bring tears, but instead there was an aching calm. "You'd laugh if you saw me now," I whispered, finally learning how to say no. The words drifted away into the wind, and I felt, strangely, that he heard me. I told him everything then, about Max, the betrayal, the silence that followed, how I'd found strength in places I never expected, and how Eleanor had become a friend when I thought I'd never trust anyone again. Speaking it aloud didn't reopen wounds, it closed them. A soft breeze moved through the trees, and for a fleeting second, I could almost feel his hand on my shoulder, the same steady warmth that once anchored me. I realized he'd been with me all along, not as memory or ghost, but as the quiet part of myself that refused to surrender. When I finally stood, The lilies trembled in the wind. I laid them down carefully and whispered, "Thank you for loving me enough to let me go." As I walked back toward the car, I didn't feel the same weight I'd carried for years. The grief was still there, yes, but gentler now, like an old friend walking beside me instead of over me. The sky had begun to clear, and sunlight filtered through the clouds, turning the grass gold. For the first time, I left the cemetery not in sorrow, but in peace. For several peaceful weeks, I believed the storm had passed. My days were quiet, filled with simple joys: fresh air, morning tea, letters from Eleanor slipped under my door. But peace, I've learned, makes some people restless. It wasn't long before the first envelope arrived, unmarked and heavy with malice. Inside was a printed letter, unsigned, claiming I had abandoned my family and was unfit to manage my affairs. I could see their tone even without their names: Max's legal phrasing, Mara's venom wrapped in self-righteous pity. I shredded it without hesitation, but they didn't stop. Within days, more letters came. Some were threatening, others feigned concern. Neighbors began receiving copies of strange complaints with my name attached, fabrications of neglect, of confusion, even of mental decline. I caught Mrs. Hanley from next door peering through her curtains one morning, her face pale with gossip. I sat at my kitchen table, trembling, fury rising like heat under my skin. For a moment, the old fear tried to return, but it didn't find a home in me anymore. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Webber. He answered on the second ring. "I was expecting this," he said after I explained. "People like your son and daughter-in-law, when they lose control, they escalate. We'll handle it." We met the next morning at his office. He looked over the letters carefully, then smiled grimly. "Harassment, intimidation, and defamation. We'll notify the police and document every piece. Evelyn, you've done nothing wrong. Don't let them drag you back into fear." Together, we filed a report with the local police station. The officer, a young woman with sharp eyes, listened quietly as I laid out the evidence. When she finished taking notes, she said, "You're doing exactly what you should. We'll start a paper trail, and if it continues, you'll be protected." The words, "you'll be protected," echoed in my mind long after I returned home. Protection. It was something I had never truly felt before, even when surrounded by family. That night, I sat by the window, watching headlights glide along the street. I refused to let their cruelty steal this peace I'd fought for. So, I began a ritual. Every time a new letter arrived, I placed it in a folder marked harassment evidence. I would not shred them anymore. I would transform their venom into proof. Eleanor came by one afternoon and found me sorting papers. "Still from them?" she asked. "Still," I replied. "But this time it doesn't hurt. It documents." She smiled softly. "That's the sound of strength, dear." Over the next weeks, Mr. Webber coordinated with law enforcement. He drafted a cease and desist notice, firm and final, and filed a preliminary request for a restraining order. When the police delivered a copy to Max and Mara's address, I imagined their shock, the sudden realization that the game had changed. They called, of course, blocked numbers, pleading voicemails, but I never answered. I didn't even listen. Every attempt became another note in the file. The fear that once governed my life began to shrink, replaced by something unfamiliar but welcome: dignity. I had lived too long, thinking endurance was strength, but I was learning that boundaries were stronger. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, I sat with Eleanor over tea. "Do you ever think they'll stop?" I asked. "They might not," she said softly. "But you'll keep standing. That's what matters. And as thunder rolled far in the distance, I realized she was right. Power wasn't about defeating them, it was about refusing to be broken again. I looked out into the storm and smiled faintly. This time, I wasn't afraid of bad weather. It began on a quiet Friday morning. I had just poured my second cup of tea when the doorbell rang. Through the camera feed on my phone, I saw a well-dressed young woman standing at my gate, holding a folder and wearing an expression of professional calm. Something in her posture made my stomach tighten. This wasn't a neighbor or a delivery. Trouble had found a new shape. When I opened the door, she smiled with careful politeness. "Good morning, Mrs. Richter. My name is Mrs. Schmidt. I'm a social investigator with the Office of Senior Services. We've received a report that you may be in an at-risk situation, and I'd like to conduct a brief wellness check." For a heartbeat, the air left the room. I knew instantly where this came from. Max and Mara had escalated again. I could almost hear their voices rehearsing the story. Lonely old woman, confused, paranoid, refusing help. It was all too predictable. I forced a steady tone. "May I see your identification?" "Of course," she said, handing me a laminated ID. It looked genuine enough. "You may come in," I said, "but I would like to have my lawyer present." She hesitated. "That's not necessary. This isn't a legal interrogation." "Then you won't mind waiting while I call him," I replied. I dialed Mr. Weber. He arrived within 20 minutes, briefcase in hand, expression calm but firm. When he entered, the young woman's confidence flickered. "I hope this won't be a problem," she said, glancing between us. Mr. Weber smiled politely. "Not at all. You may proceed, but I'll be observing." Mrs. Schmidt opened her folder. "We've received reports of sudden financial changes, possible isolation from family, and installation of unnecessary security measures. Some sources suggested you've refused medical and legal help." The words landed like stones. Unnecessary security, isolation, refused help. They had twisted every act of self-preservation into a symptom of madness. "May I ask who filed these reports?" Mr. Weber said smoothly. "I'm afraid that information is confidential," she answered. I met her gaze steadily. "You've been told a story," I said, "and it isn't the truth." And so I did. I showed her my meticulously organized folder, bank records, legal documents, copies of police reports, even the folder marked harassment evidence. I told her about the restraining order, the fabricated letters, the attempts to declare me incompetent. Her pen slowed, then stopped. Mr. Weber added gently, "All her financial and legal actions are fully documented and voluntary. We have verified everything." Mrs. Schmidt reviewed the papers for several long minutes. I could see the conflict behind her professional expression, the quiet realization that she'd been sent on a wild goose chase. "Mrs. Richter," she said at last, "do you manage your own finances entirely?" "Yes," I replied. "I can show you my accounts, investments, tax statements, all up to date." "Do you live independently?" "I do. I cook, drive, and care for myself. You may check the kitchen if you'd like. It's cleaner than most." A faint smile crossed her face. "Do you take any medication?" "Only vitamins and aspirin, as needed." She glanced at Mr. Weber, who nodded. "All of that is confirmed by medical records." Mrs. Schmidt closed her folder slowly. The tension drained from her shoulders. "I see no indication that you are in danger or unable to manage your affairs. I'll close this report immediately." For a moment, silence filled the room, pure relief. Then she added softly, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Richter. Sometimes family concerns turn into overreactions." "Sometimes," I said. they turn into weapons. After she left, Mr. Weber and I stood by the window watching her car disappear down the street. They're desperate now, he said. They know they're losing control. Desperate people make mistakes, I replied quietly. And I'm done paying for theirs. That evening, I lit a single candle and sat at my dining table. The house was still. The shadows no longer frightened me. They felt like guardians. I opened my journal and wrote the date. The day they failed to take my voice. A week after the visit from Mrs. Schmidt, the silence returned. But it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the waiting kind. The kind that hums beneath your skin. I knew Max and Mara wouldn't stop. They had failed to break me with shame and bureaucracy, so now they would reach for something bigger. The call from Mr. Weber came late in the afternoon. His tone was calm, but I could hear the tension under it. "Evelyn," he said, "I've received notice from a family law firm in the city. They intend to file for guardianship on the basis of mental incompetence. It hasn't been submitted yet, but the paperwork is drafted." I didn't speak for several seconds. Guardianship. The word felt heavy, poisonous. "They're going to try to take everything again," I said quietly. "They'll try," he confirmed. "But this time, we're ready." He outlined the plan carefully. We'd gather every document, every letter, every witness who had seen their harassment. He'd already contacted Mrs. Schmidt, who agreed to testify if needed, confirming that I was competent and capable. "They overplayed their hand," he said. "We'll use their own reports against them." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk, surrounded by folders, rereading everything: bank statements, letters, the restraining order. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with determination. I was no longer fighting for money or property. I was fighting for truth, the proof that my voice still mattered. Eleanor called when she saw the light on in my window. "You're still up," she said softly. "You heard?" "I did," I admitted. "You'll win," she said. "Because they're fighting for control, but you're fighting for peace. That always wins in the end." Her faith steadied me. I wrote a list that night. Documents to copy, people to contact, evidence to organize. It felt almost like preparing armor, each record a shield, each truth a sword. Over the next days, Mr. Weber and I worked relentlessly. He arranged a meeting with a psychologist to assess my cognitive health formally, preempting their accusations. He reached out to former colleagues, neighbors, and even the officer who had taken my harassment report. Every signature, every statement built a wall they couldn't climb. Still, fear crept in during the quiet moments. There were nights I'd wake to every sound outside, imagining shadows with familiar voices. But instead of shrinking, I prayed. Not for revenge, but for strength to remain calm when the storm arrived. By the end of the week, my kitchen table was covered in neat stacks of paper, labeled and ready. When Mr. Weber stopped by to review them, he smiled with quiet pride. "This," he said, tapping the top folder, "is what self-respect looks like on paper." For the first time, I believed him. The letter from the courthouse arrived on a grey Thursday morning. Even before I opened it, I knew what it was. The heavy paper, the official seal, it all carried the same cold authority I had once trusted. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. "Petition for guardianship due to mental incompetence," it read, filed by Maxwell Richter and Mara Richter, my own son and his wife. Mr. Weber came within the hour, his face tight with professional composure, but eyes filled with quiet anger. "They've done it," I said simply. He nodded. "We'll respond immediately. But Evelyn, this won't be easy. They've fabricated evidence." He spread out copies of their filing across my table like a battlefield map. There were false statements from supposed witnesses, medical notes I had never seen, and even pharmacy records claiming I had refused medication for paranoia. They built a case out of lies, I whispered. Yes, he said, but lies leave fingerprints. The first shock came from one of the listed witnesses, Mr. Green, my pharmacist. We'll speak to him, Mr. Weber said. If he's been coerced or misled, he'll have to clarify that under oath. The next name made my stomach tighten. Mr. Davis, my unpleasant neighbor. That afternoon we visited the pharmacy. Mr. Green's face went pale when I asked him why he had signed a statement claiming I misused medications. Mara came in, told me you were acting strangely and might need help, he confessed. She gave me a form to confirm you had irregular purchases. I just signed it, assuming it was for insurance. His voice trembled. Mr. Weber handed him a notepad. Then write that down. A full statement. The truth. By evening, I was exhausted. I sat with Eleanor on her porch, telling her everything. She listened silently, then said, "They're desperate. Desperation makes people stupid, but it also makes them dangerous. Keep your courage, Evelyn." Her words sank deep into me. The next day, Mr. Weber arranged an appointment with Dr. Moore, a respected psychologist. "We'll counter their false claims with verified evaluations," he said. Dr. Moore greeted me warmly, her questions measured but kind. For 2 hours, she tested my memory, reasoning, and awareness. When we finished, she smiled. "You're as sharp as ever, Mrs. Richter. I'll write a full report. And don't worry, truth holds better under light than lies." Meanwhile, Weber uncovered something worse. Mara and Max had falsified unpaid bills, copies of invoices from a clinic I'd never visited. They even forged my signature on a supposed psychiatric referral. "We'll bring a forensic expert," Weber said, "to confirm the forgery. And I'll subpoena the clinic directly. Every lie they've told will unravel." Days turned into weeks. Each morning I faced the mirror, repeating a silent mantra. I am not what they say I am. I began documenting everything in a bound journal, noting every interaction, every threat, every phone call I ignored. It became my proof of endurance. One evening, Eleanor brought over soup and quiet company. "You look tired," she said, "but proud, too." "I suppose I am," I smiled weakly. I never thought I'd have to prove I was sane just to keep my own life. "Sometimes," she said. "Sanity is the loudest rebellion." The preliminary hearing date was set. Mr. Weber outlined our strategy at his office. "They'll try to frame you as erratic and confused. You'll stay composed. Dr. Moore and Mr. Green will testify first, then the forensic expert. We'll dismantle their claims piece by piece." I nodded. "And if the judge believes them?" "Then," he said, "we appeal. And if we lose again, we keep fighting. Because what they're doing isn't just unethical, it's criminal." When morning came, the sky was clear and cold. Mr. Weber met me at the courthouse steps, his briefcase full of truth. Inside, the air smelled of paper and tension. As we waited to enter the courtroom, I looked at the door with calm certainty. This was no longer about defending myself. It was about showing the world what deceit looked like when the mask finally cracked. The days after the court notice felt like the quiet before a storm. But it wasn't a silence of fear anymore. It was preparation. Word had spread, and help began arriving in ways I never expected. For years, I had stood alone, thinking independence meant solitude. But now, people began stepping forward one by one to stand with me. The first call came from Mrs. Schmidt, the social worker who had once come to inspect me. "Mrs. Richter," she said, her tone warmer than before. I heard about the filing. If needed, I'll testify. I have the full report showing your competence and independence. Her words filled my chest with something I hadn't felt in months: vindication. Then came Dr. Moore, the psychologist. Mr. Weber contacted me, she said. I'm preparing my deposition. Their accusations won't hold. You've got logic, clarity, and evidence on your side. I hung up, feeling the strength of their faith settling into my bones. Each new ally felt like another light flickering on in a dark corridor. Eleanor, too, was relentless. She organized the neighbors she trusted, people who had seen the harassment firsthand. We're writing letters, she told me. You're not alone anymore, Evelyn. When I visited Mr. Weber's office later that week, he was surrounded by piles of papers and witness statements. We're building a fortress, he said, tapping a folder labeled Character Affidavits. Your reputation won't just survive this, it will stand taller. Among the names were people I hadn't spoken to in years: a retired librarian I once volunteered with, the postman who'd seen Mara's letters piling up in my mailbox, even the police officer who had taken my original harassment report. All had offered statements. They remember your kindness, Weber said simply. That's not something liars can erase. We worked late that night, organizing testimony and cross-referencing timelines. I watched Weber's tired hands flipping through each page with meticulous care. You've inspired something, Evelyn, he said quietly. People see what's happening, and they want to stop it. That night, I sat by my window again, the same spot where I had once watched the world in fear. But this time, I wasn't afraid of the silence. I saw the porch lights of my neighbors glowing one by one, and I realized they were watching with me, not against me. I picked up my pen and wrote in my journal. For years, I thought strength meant standing alone. But sometimes, true power arrives as outstretched hands. Steady, unwavering, human. Outside, the wind carried a sense of movement, of something gathering just beyond the horizon. The storm was still coming, but this time, I wouldn't face it alone. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and anxiety. As I stepped through the heavy glass doors, I could hear the echo of my shoes on the marble floor, a sound that felt like the beating of my heart. It was the day I had both dreaded and prepared for. After months of fear, accusations, and manipulation, I was finally here to defend not just my finances, but my dignity. Mr. Weber walked beside me, carrying a briefcase filled with evidence, my life condensed into folders, testimonies, and photographs. Remember, Evelyn, he said softly, they have to prove you're incompetent. We just need to show the truth. His calm steadiness grounded me. Inside the courtroom, the air was dense with tension. Max and Mara sat at the opposite table, both dressed in dark suits, their faces masks of false concern. My son avoided my gaze, but Mara stared directly at me, her expression as sharp as glass. Behind them sat their lawyer, an older man who exuded the kind of confidence that comes from rehearsed manipulation. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The clerk announced the case, and for the first time, I heard it phrased in cold legal language: petition for declaration of mental incompetence and appointment of guardianship. My stomach twisted, but I refused to look down. Their lawyer began with a speech that sounded rehearsed to perfection. Your Honor, he said, this is not about greed. This is about concern. Mrs. Richter has shown erratic behavior, cutting off family support, isolating herself, and showing signs of paranoia. Every word was like poison coated in honey. I wanted to speak, to object, but Mr. Weber's hand on mine reminded me, patience. Then came their witnesses. Mara cried on cue, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She's like a mother to me, she said, her voice trembling. But lately she's been confused, forgetful, angry. We're just trying to help her. Mr. Webber rose calmly for the cross-examination. Mrs. Lane, he said, when was the last time you visited my client without requesting financial assistance? Mara blinked rapidly, caught off guard. I can't recall the exact date. Was it before or after she paid for your honeymoon? The courtroom stirred with quiet murmurs. When it was Max's turn, my heart ached. Hearing my son testify against me was worse than any insult. My mother's not herself, he said. She's been manipulated by people who want her money. I watched his lips move, the same mouth that once kissed my forehead goodnight. Webber stood again. Mr. Lane, how old are you? 35. Do you work? I'm between jobs. And your wife? She's been looking. So you rely on your mother's income to live? Max hesitated. We did, yes. And when she stopped paying, you decided she must be insane. Silence. The judge's expression softened slightly. They called their next witness, a neighbor named Mr. Davis, who accused me of being paranoid. He described my security cameras as obsessive. But when Webber questioned him, Davis admitted he had never spoken to me directly. So you're basing your opinion on what you saw from across the street? Webber asked. That's correct. And you consider installing home security to be evidence of madness? The courtroom chuckled quietly. Then came their final witness, a doctor who had never even met me but had reviewed notes supplied by Mara. Webber objected immediately. Your Honor, this so-called evaluation was conducted without the patient's consent. It's inadmissible hearsay. The judge nodded. Sustained. When it was our turn, Webber called Dr. Moore first. She testified with calm authority, presenting my medical and psychological evaluations. Mrs. Richter's cognitive results are well above average, she said. There is no evidence of mental decline, only emotional resilience. Then Mrs. Schmidt, the social worker, took the stand. I personally investigated the claims, she said. There was no cause for concern. Mrs. Richter is competent, articulate, and entirely self-sufficient. Finally, it was my turn. As I stood, my knees trembled, but not from fear, only from the weight of years spent being underestimated. I took the oath and looked at the judge. Your Honor, I began, this isn't about my health. It's about my money and the people who can't live without it. Webber guided me gently through the questions. I explained how I had supported Max and Mara for years. Rent, furniture, medical bills, even their wedding expenses. Did you ever refuse them before? He asked. No, I said. I only said no once, when I realized they no longer saw me as a mother, but as a wallet. When their lawyer cross-examined me, he tried to twist my words. So you do admit to cutting off your family? I admit, I said, meeting his eyes, to saving myself. The judge's pen stopped mid-motion. For a brief second, the whole room was silent. Even Max looked up, unsure of what to say. Webber's closing argument was quiet, but devastating. Your Honor, we've seen no evidence of incompetence, only of independence. What we've truly witnessed today is elder financial abuse disguised as filial concern. Mrs. Richter has been exploited, threatened, and humiliated, all because she found the courage to say no. When the judge finally spoke, my breath caught in my throat. The court finds no indication of mental incompetence, he said. The petition is denied in full. Furthermore, this court recognizes potential financial exploitation by the petitioners. Case dismissed. A rush of relief swept through me. I felt tears on my cheeks, but they weren't of sorrow. They were of liberation. Weber turned to me with a small smile. "You're free, Evelyn," he whispered. "Completely free." As I walked out of the courtroom, sunlight poured through the glass doors, washing over me like forgiveness. The storm was over. I had won, not just in law, but in spirit. And for the first time in years, I knew exactly who I was. The morning after the verdict, I woke before dawn. For the first time in months, the house felt still, not with dread, but with peace. The walls, once echoing with fear and whispers of betrayal, now seemed to breathe again. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the horizon blush with the first streaks of light. The storm that had hovered over me for so long had finally broken. Mr. Weber called just after sunrise. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Lighter," I said. "As if I've been carrying a mountain on my back and someone finally lifted it." He chuckled softly. "You earned that freedom. The paperwork will take a few days, but legally it's over." I could hear the satisfaction in his voice, a quiet victory shared between two weary fighters. When I stepped outside later, the air was sharp and clean. The courthouse, the confrontation, the long nights of worry, they all felt like a distant dream, fading at last. I went to the florist at the corner and bought a bouquet of white tulips. The woman behind the counter smiled. "Celebration?" she asked. I nodded. "Something like that." Eleanor arrived mid-morning with pastries and an enormous grin. "So," she said, setting the bag down, "the dragon's been slain?" I laughed harder than I had in years. More like the truth finally grew wings. We sat at my kitchen table, eating croissants and talking about everything except the trial. It was the first time I'd felt normal again. No fear, no performance, just two women sharing warmth and silence. Later that day, we visited Mr. Weber's office to sign final documents. His secretary, who had watched the entire case unfold from the sidelines, clapped when she saw me. "You're kind of a legend around here," she said with a wink. Weber smiled. "You've reminded us all that justice still exists, Mrs. Richter, even when it limps." On the way home, I stopped by the park near the courthouse. The benches were slick from the morning rain. I sat down and placed the tulips beside me, watching children chase pigeons under a wide, forgiving sky. For months, I had thought of justice as a weapon, something to strike back with. But sitting there, I realized it was really a kind of release, not revenge, but restoration. When I got home, I went through my old box of letters, unopened apologies, forgotten invitations, and receipts from years of giving. I burned them in the fireplace, one by one, watching each page curl and blacken into ash. It wasn't anger anymore. It was cleansing. That night, before bed, I wrote my final entry in the journal that had carried me through the ordeal. They tried to take my freedom. Instead, they showed me what it truly means. I closed the book, placed it on my nightstand, and turned off the lamp. The darkness no longer frightened me. It felt like the world finally exhaled with me. Tomorrow would not be about defense, or survival, or proving anything. Tomorrow would simply be mine. 6 months later, the world felt entirely different. My days no longer began with dread or obligation, but with small, deliberate joys. Brewing coffee, watering my plants, opening the curtains to sunlight instead of shadows. The silence that once haunted me had transformed into something sacred. It was the sound of my own peace. I had sold the old house, the one filled with memories both sweet and sour, and moved into a modest apartment overlooking the river. From my balcony, I could watch the sunrise every morning, golden light rippling across the water like forgiveness itself. I didn't need much anymore. My needs had grown smaller, but my spirit had grown vast. Every corner of the new place felt intentional. There was no clutter, no ghosts of expectation. I kept one shelf for books, one for photographs, and one for my journal. The rest I left open, space for whatever the future wanted to bring. Sometimes Eleanor came by with a basket of baked bread or fresh flowers. We'd sit outside and talk about everything but the past: music, weather, and the silly stray cat that had adopted the courtyard. I had started volunteering at the local senior centre twice a week, helping other women navigate financial independence. Many of them arrived with the same confusion and pain I once carried. "You're stronger than you think," I'd tell them, and I meant it every time. The first check one of them wrote for herself made me cry, not because of the money, but because I recognized that tremor of rediscovery in her hands, the moment a woman realizes she belongs to herself again. Mr. Weber visited once, bringing along a copy of the final court ruling. "Frame it if you like," he said with a smile. "It's more than a legal victory. It's a monument to self-respect." I laughed and tucked it in a drawer. "I don't need to see it," I said. "I live it." He nodded. Then that's justice fulfilled. Eleanor and I had taken to walking every Sunday morning, two old souls gossiping about the world's nonsense. She liked to tease me about being famous in our neighborhood after the trial. "People whisper when you pass," she'd say, not in pity anymore, but in admiration. I used to shrink from attention. Now I smiled and waved back. One afternoon, I stood by the river and thought of my late husband. For years, I'd wondered if he'd be proud of how I'd lived, or disappointed by how I'd allowed others to take advantage. But that day, standing in the sunlight, I felt him in the wind, in the warmth, in the steadiness of my own heartbeat. He didn't need to forgive me. I had finally forgiven myself. Traveling became my new joy. I visited Florence, Prague, and the quiet hills of Ireland. I sent postcards to Eleanor from every place, always signing them, still learning, still free. Each trip reminded me that life could still surprise me, still open new doors, even when I thought the house had long since closed. Sometimes, at night, I'd look out over the river and whisper a quiet thank you, to fate, to time, to pain itself. All of it had been a teacher. I was no longer surviving. I was living. And in the reflection of the water, I finally saw myself, not as a mother, a widow, or a victim, but as a whole, radiant woman. If Evelyn's story touched your heart, don't let it fade into silence. Share your thoughts below, your reflections, your own stories, your strength. These tales remind us that no matter our age or scars, reclaiming dignity is never too late. If you believe in voices like hers, subscribe, comment, and join our growing circle of resilience. Every story shared here builds a bridge of understanding and courage. Thank you for watching, listening, and feeling with us. Until the next story, stay strong, stay kind, and never stop standing tall.